We're going to do something a little bit new in this class, and I'm going to work from life. I've developed a still life with cherries on a tan background, and I'm going to develop that into a painting for this class. So here my bowl of cherries. The fabric goes behind. And then these wrinkles are going to be essential to telling the story of how the fabric is moving. And that movement is what gives me a lot of interest in the piece. And I have this last cherry right here in the foreground. So I just have to sketch the cherries in the bowl. You start with the big shapes, like the bowl and the outline of the fabric, and then you add those small details, the cherries in the bowl, on top. And I'm not even bothering to erase those lines. I'm keeping them nice and loose. So then, let me incorporate a little bit of shading to get a sense of the light source. To do that quickly, I'm going to change to a big chunk of graphite. And I have to simplify these folds in the fabric as I go along because I don't want them to be too overwhelming. Here's a really prominent crease in the fabric. It's just that you don't want to emphasize everything. But I like this composition. I'm going to move forward with this vantage point and this basic setup. So now let me move forward to the watercolor paper. I'm going to go about the same process for transferring this to the watercolor paper and start with my largest shapes. And I also want to sketch in the boundaries of where I want it to end, both top and bottom. So first I'm going to sketch out the overall shape of everything. Then I'm going to start to better define for myself the shapes within the large boundary. So here's my box edge, here's the uppermost fold, and then here is the bowl of cherries on the top. See how I just go from one line to the next. When I have the boundaries in place, this process becomes a lot less complex because I know in at least general terms where everything should end. So I'm just going to take a little bit of time, clean up these lines, and then we're going to move forward to the painting. Now my lines are cleaned up, and I'm going to start out the painting by protecting those cherries. So I'll do that with some Frisket film. That's a sticky backed paper that's removable. And you can press it down right over the cherries and trace the shapes, then cut them out. Now the Frisket's down, but I need to touch up a few of the corners. So I'm using my Misket for that. Wait for that to dry, and then we'll start laying in the background. Okay. Remember, no matter what you're painting, even if it's a flat color, to keep it from being too flat, you want to add in more than one color. Then I'm just going to slap that color down. I didn't protect the glass, so I'm just going to carefully go around it with the edge of my flat. But for the other colors, I'll just add some water and keep feeding into it with some different variations on those beiges. You're trying to emphasize, though, an interesting twist on a plain beige fabric. I'm also going to throw in some blues to make some gray tones and emphasize those on the shadow side. So here's a good stopping place. I'll come back to this when the first base coat here is dried, and we'll add some more shadows and work some more on the rest of it. Now that the color is dry, I'm going to see some sharp definition lines. So here and there I'm just going to darken up the patterns. In areas where I want the color to stay sort of soft, I'm using more water, and I'll just wet over the top edge that needs to be lost like this, and that way I can lose some of that definition. Then in other spots where the color is already wet, I can darken up and it will flood in to fill that space, but I don't actually have to paint it. See how I just drop the color and let it spread. I'm also going to add some reds because the shadow on the khaki fabric is both blue and kind of reddish. That color is still wet, so it's just going to flood out naturally. And I want there to be a contrast of soft and hard lines. So that's why you put in some initial shading when it's all wet. Those are going to give you soft edges. And then you put down more lines after the color has had a chance to dry, and that will give you the hard edges. Then if you step back from the work at this point, it's starting to look pretty intensely liney and geometric. So I'm going to soften up some of these areas. I'll just add some water to the brush and soften one edge of the darkest folds. So let me work this way for a little bit and then let it dry and come back to it and start working on those cherries. While the cloth was drying, I went ahead and added just a little bit of detail to the wood box. Now I'm going to remove the misket and frisk it from the cherries. Now before I add the base coat to the cherries, I want to protect some of these really bright highlights. So I'm using some masking fluid and I'm going to protect a little spot right where the light is catching each cherry. Now I'm ready to add some color to these cherries. I'm going to use some pinks and reds and oranges. So not just red. So look for the base tone of each cherry and fill that color in. Then to get some of that variation, I'm just going to blot that wood color with a tissue, focusing right around the highlights that I saved, and that will give me a nice color variation. Just do that for all of the cherries. For darker areas, you can add some blue and gray that down a little bit. See how you can just touch into the wet area with some different colors and make it nice and vibrant. As the color dries around the blot, you may have to go back and add some fresh color. I'm doing the same thing with these cherries. And I'm going to paint the cherries and then the glass around them. And then for the cluster of cherries in the glass, as often as possible I'm going to paint them as one big piece. I'm not going to paint them separately. So here I'm dotting in just straight blue. I'm not mixing it into a purple on the palette before I add it. And don't do the same thing everywhere. That defeats the purpose. You want there to be variation. You want there to be some contrasts and colors. Even though it's a bowl of the same sort of fruit, every cherry is unique, and you want to bring out those unique qualities to make your picture more individual, more interesting. Now I'm going to let these dry, and then I'll add a shadow coat on top. Now that the cherries have dried, I'm going to take that highlight off. So to soften those, I'm going to get a flat brush, dampen up one corner, and soften that hard, contrasty edge. And then you can do the same thing to lift out a highlight on one corner. Just dampen, and then if you need to blot, just have a tissue ready and you can blot those highlights. So I'm going to work this way for a while, and then we'll come back to do some detail on the glass. It can be difficult to paint glass because so much of it is clear. So what you're really painting is the refracting color right behind the glass. I'm going to mix up a puddle of a cerulean with some yellow to make a kind of gray. And then use a flat brush and start to lay down a color for the rim. That rim color will go all the way around like this. And I will mix into that with some darker cerulean here and there. Then I'll do the same thing down at the edge. Give yourself some space around the outside of a glass. And try to keep your lines nice and clean. Then in the top here, I'm going to have some brown showing through because of the khaki. So you're not outlining, but you're giving the indication of the outline of the form. It's just you're trying to keep it as minimal as possible. See, it doesn't take very much for that glass to come through. Then I'm going to mix up a blue and add some more shadows to the underside of the cherries. And doing just a little bit of work on the underside of these cherries will help them to lay down flat on the fabric. And then I soften the outer rim by adding some cerulean blue and going over a second time. I'll finish up with some color inside the glass here. Okay, let's let that dry again. Okay, let's finish this up. I'm going to go to my rigger and add some more details on that glass. I'm going to do a skipping line here and there to emphasize the darks. I'll put a highlight line over the top here just to help show that that is glass going over the top of the cherries. Just a few little highlights. And then, of course, the stem. You only want to do it once, so make sure that you have plenty of dark color. Then try to visualize the line first. Make it with your hand a few times. And then zoop, one swoop. Now the last thing that you might want to do is to add a shadow of the entire thing. Get your big flat out again. Mix up some shadow color. I'm using purples. And then I'll just carefully add this smooth shadow under the blanket. So you don't want to fuss around with it. You want to do it in one solid movement. And it's not going to go everywhere, but just here and there to show that this is lifting off the surface. So that might be as far as you take it. You can always go back into it if you want, add more details, pull more out, but you don't want it to get too busy. Fight the urge to make things too overly busy and detailed. Working from life is always really fun and exciting. You can learn a lot because of course you're taking something that's directly three-dimensional and putting it onto a two-dimensional surface instead of taking a photo of something that's been flattened for you already and putting that on the two-dimensional surface. So this is really where it's at artistically. Try to do as much painting and drawing from life as you possibly can. It's the best way to learn. So thank you for watching. I hope you join us again next time.